Welcome and thank you all for joining our monthly webinar. I'm excited for today's discussion on overcoming obstacles, insight from Black women prosecutors. My name is Chantel Williams, and I'm a policy attorney at the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution at John Jay College. The IAP provides a national platform to bring together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies, cutting-edge scholarship, and innovative thinking. The IAP champions criminal justice reform policies that advance community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. We are honored to hear from our distinguished panelists today as they discuss the tremendous contributions Black women prosecutors have made to the field of criminal justice, as well as the challenges they have faced in doing so. Black women are underrepresented in the field of prosecution, making up roughly 1% of elected prosecutors nationwide. Nonetheless, they have played a unique and crucial role as leaders in the prosecutorial reform movement, both as elected prosecutors and line attorneys, all the while facing personal attacks rooted in racism and sexism as they continue to pursue justice for the communities they serve. Our guests today are Black women who have made incredible contributions to the world of prosecutorial reform. We at the IAP are honored to provide a forum for such a vital and timely discussion. In the interest of time, I will briefly introduce today's panelists. We will be placing a link to their full bios in the chat, and we encourage you to read about all of their accomplishments. State's Attorney Kimberly Fox is the first Black woman to lead the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the second largest prosecutor's office in the country. As Cook County State's Attorney, she is undertaking substantial criminal justice reforms focused on public safety and equity. District Attorney Dahlia Racine is the first woman chief prosecutor in Douglas County, Georgia's history. As district attorney, she has championed the responsibility of elected prosecutors to keep their communities safe by implementing innovative practices and policies that reduce the number of repeat offenders who cause harm. And our final panelist is Jami Hodge, the second executive director of Equal Justice USA. She brings more than 15 years of criminal justice experience as a prosecutor, policy advisor, and technical assistance provider, including her work launching the Reshaping Prosecution program at the Vera Institute of Justice. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to today's moderator, Angela J. Davis, Distinguished Professor of Law at American University, Washington College of Law. Professor Davis is an expert in criminal law and procedure with a focus on prosecutorial power and racism within the criminal justice system. Professor Davis is the author of Arbitrary Justice, The Power of the American Prosecutor, as well as many other influential publications. We are also delighted that she has recently joined the IAP's Board of Advisors. Thank you for agreeing to moderate this panel, Professor Davis.
Thank you, Chantel, and thanks to the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution for inviting me to moderate this really important discussion during Black History Month. I'll start by saying that prosecutors are the most powerful officials in our criminal legal system. They have almost unlimited power and discretion. And unfortunately, historically and even currently, some prosecutors have abused that power and have used it in ways that have created many of the injustices in our criminal legal system, at least contributing to them. Including mass incarceration and unwarranted racial disparities. And they've done so sometimes inadvertently, but they have contributed to those problems. Most prosecutors are elected officials, and historically they have run for office unopposed and served for decades. But in recent years, some individuals have run for office challenging the incumbents and have run for office on a platform that reflects what the Supreme Court says prosecutors are supposed to do, and that is do justice instead of just seeking convictions. These prosecutors have run on a platform of reducing the prison and jail population, consistent with public safety, of course, of reducing and hopefully eliminating racial disparities and otherwise making the system more fair. And as Chantel pointed out, although only about 1% of prosecutors are Black women, some of the most progressive and successful reform-minded chief prosecutors are Black women. And we are fortunate to have two of those elected prosecutors with us today, District Attorney Racine and State's Attorney Fox with us today, and also a former federal prosecutor, Jami Hodge, who, as Chantel pointed out, worked to she ran a program that trained and supported progressive prosecutors and established and founded an initiative to support Black women chief prosecutors in particular, and is now continuing her justice work as executive director of Equal Justice USA. So I want to jump right in and start our conversation by asking each of you, what brought you to this work? Why did you decide to become a prosecutor? What was your path to getting to this point? And I'll start with you, DA Racine.
Great. Thank you, Angela, and thank you for having us here today for this really important topic. So I am a career prosecutor, which I know is a bit of a rarity in this work. I started out at the Fulton DA's office, which y'all may have heard of, and then to the DeKalb County DA's office, worked at a nonprofit for a couple of years, teaching gender-based violence investigations and prosecutions across the country before becoming the elected after running for 10 years. But really, what brought me to this work, I think number one is upbringing. So my father is retired law enforcement and my mother is a retired legal secretary. And so I was always exposed kind of to this world of the criminal legal system. But what really shapes the work that I do is three pillars that I've carried with me throughout my entire career. The first is my own victimization as a child and having that voice for advocacy, understanding what it feels like to feel voiceless, to feel trapped in a situation. And so that really being the guiding principle to the advocacy work that I've done as a prosecutor, as a line prosecutor, and continue as an elected. The second pillar is the fact that my brother lost his battle to his addiction and passed away a couple of years ago. But pretty much the vast majority of the time that I knew my brother, he was living in his addiction. And in that time frame, he was in and out of the criminal justice system. He was in and out of our carceral systems. And the very definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And so really that very close experience drives the need to find innovation. We are obviously a touch point for all of these people who are harmed, all these people who are hurting. What can we do, because we are necessitated by the system to be this touch point? What can we do that's different to actually bring about healing from these harms? And then the last part is not only being a woman of color, but raising three children, two of whom are boys, operating in a system for decades that I am equally terrified of. For my own family, for those in our community. And so knowing that if there is no more important task than making sure that we have a system that is fair and just in the work that we are doing, because it is so important. And so those are really the things that brought me to this work, to make sure that we had a system that could reflect the ideals of what the system can be. And not to say there's perfection, it's hard work. And that's what we're going to talk about that today. It is hard work, but that is really what brought me to this work and continues to drive the work that I'm doing.
Thank you so much. And let me just start by saying, I plan to call you all State's Attorney Fox, District Attorney Racine, Ms. Hodge, but that seems so artificial because I know these women. So I respect you all, and I want everybody else to call you by your titles, but may I call you by your first names because it just sounds more natural. Thank you. Kim, can you please tell us what brought you to this work?
Certainly. Thank you, Professor Davis.
You must call me Angela.
Yes, Angela, thank you so much. It is really an honor and a privilege to be in discussion with you and my fellow prosecutors and former prosecutors. I come to this work much like Dahlia. I've been in government public service work for almost the entirety of my legal career. But why prosecution? I grew up in one of the toughest public housing projects in the country in Cabrini Green in the 70s and 80s. And I have seen people who have been harmed. Myself, I share with Dahlia have been a victim of childhood sexual abuse and assault. I knew people in my family who had been hurt, and I also knew people who had hurt others. And I also lived in a community where there was so much love and care and concern, and also so much neglect and disinvestment and violence. And a system that didn't seem to appreciate that those complex realities could exist at the same time. And so I went to law school wanting to be able to be an asset to the community, like the community that I grew up in. I started my career as a public guardian here in Cook County. We have an office that has lawyers that represent children who are navigating the foster care system. And the way the system worked is that the state's attorney's office would bring cases determining who would be fit to be parents, whether children were abused or neglected, whether a child would go into foster care or remain home. And in doing that work, I saw myself in my clients, that the majority of my clients were Black. They came from neighborhoods like mine. They had family members who suffered through addiction. You know, I had a mother who used drugs daily because she didn't have access to proper mental health care to deal with the late diagnosis of bipolar disorder. I saw myself in my clients and realized, but for the grace of God, there go I. And that these families weren't actually families that needed the influence of the state. They needed investment in their communities. And watching the state have so much power to dismantle homes. And I decided in doing that work that I wanted to be a prosecutor because I wanted the power that you described, Angela, to say no. I wanted the power to discern and use that discretion of, is this really harm or is this something else? Because I had seen that power used in a way that was reckless and dangerous, particularly to communities like mine. And so I became a prosecutor in the child welfare space. I did that for 3 years. I went over to the juvenile delinquency space, and what was shocking and horrifying to me is in the child welfare space, prosecutors are supposed to be moving in what's in the best interest of a child, appreciating the harm that they have suffered. On the delinquency side, it's almost as though we forgot all of the harm that they had endured, that we so much said that we wanted to protect them from, and we were throwing them away. And so I decided to run for state's attorney after, several years in the state's attorney's office, having worked at the highest levels of government, to have the power, not just on an individual level to respond to cases, but to set policy, to set direction, to create an environment in which, it's not a one-off when we're using our discretion to do the right thing, but to set the standard, to set the table for what that would look like. And so that is why I did it. And I did it without apology for a constituency that was the one that I came from. That the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system disproportionately has utilizers, victims, defendants, witnesses who come from neighborhoods and communities like the one I came from. And far too often we were putting people in these roles who had such a disconnect from those communities and what they thought was in the best interest that were actually harmful. And so I ran on a platform that was speaking directly to those communities, and have tried to lead with that community at the forefront.
Thank you. Jami, tell us your story.
Yeah, also just want to chime in with my thanks to sit on this esteemed panel, and it's just wonderful to be in community with this incredible group of Black women leaders. So hearing Dahlia and Kim, and also appreciate the permission to use first names, but hearing them share just kind of underscored for me how I was thinking about my answer to this question isn't that it was so much a career path as a calling. And even hearing them both describe their own personal experiences that deeply impact how they approach this work, that resonates, it just sort of underscores that point. I wasn't a person who really even knew much about what prosecutors did. I was very focused on going to law school as a way to escape poverty. and as a way to have a career where I could make a difference. I had no idea what that meant. I just knew, that lawyers seemed to be able, they had a role in civil rights, but also seemed to like have some money and be okay in terms of taking care of basic needs, and just coming up, in Detroit, and sort of first in my family to graduate college and certainly go to law school. Both of those things were important to me. But I got to the end of law school and had this really focused goal from the age of 9 years old, and was just like, now what, and ended up at a law firm for about 4 years. And it was a conversation with a mentor, who is now a dean of a law school locally, Roger Fairfax, who was the person. Yes, your dean. Who, I grabbed onto, and not that he was so much more senior than I was. He's, probably not that many years ahead of me in terms of career, but at the time, being a brand new lawyer, moving to the city, just in the DC area, and not knowing what to do, he was such a wonderful, kind thought partner, and he was the one who suggested to me that I look at the U.S. Attorney's Office here. And what's funny is I remember Googling and finding that there were these like manuals for people who planned the path to become an assistant U.S. attorney in college. Like, this is the path, and this is how it was this. And I was just kind of like, yeah, I'm not sure about this, because everything I knew about policing and prosecution, I just had a view of them as simply the folks who put people in prison, and that they did it unfairly. And certainly my parents had the talk with us, the talk that so many of us are still having with our children about police not being a place of safety and avoiding the system. And I'd already had cousins who were incarcerated by that point, and then my own brother ended up incarcerated. And then also knew from violence experienced in my family that the system had nothing to offer when my father suffered a traumatic brain injury from an armed robbery, that there wasn't anything there that was going to help with our economic security, the trauma we were all dealing with in very different ways, including the addiction it led my brother into. So for me, it was oh, really? A prosecutor? When it was first suggested. But he was so kind to have me meet with some prosecutors and have coffee. That was the first time I learned about things like diversion, or that there was all this discretion to do something other than send people to prison. I recognized the power, just that they had. I just didn't realize that there were other options, and that there was something else that could be done, and that power could be used differently. And so I decided to go that route because I wanted to be one of those power holders who saw the people we were interacting with as people, as my brother, as my cousins, as my uncles, especially because in DC it was primarily Black men, as opposed to defendants, offenders, and all the other also even worse titles and names that people would give to the folks we were making decisions about as prosecutors.
Great, thank you, thank you. I want a little bit more from you though, Jami. Like, what brought you from the U.S. Attorney's Office to doing the work with prosecutors? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, just having some opportunities to be exposed, right? So worked as a prosecutor, but then had an opportunity to do some details in the Obama administration and criminal justice policy roles. And I think that was where it opened my eyes that these problems aren't just trees, that there's a forest that's on fire, and that there are large-scale decisions that are made that intentionally create the racial disparities that we see, and the ways that our punitive approaches aren't creating safety. And so really the more I learned, and particularly got a chance to learn our history and understand the intentionality in which our criminal legal system had been set up to control and oppress the formerly enslaved, and that those same sort of machinations still exist, and the racial disparities we see are not just by accident. The more I wanted to do something about it, and to do something at a larger level, and had the opportunity to go to Vera to help found and lead the Reshaping Prosecution program, because as these incredible lead prosecutors who had the courage to run on these platforms of change, they were taking over offices that were traditional law and order offices. They were coming in to bring change, but they were taking over staffs and teams that only knew the status quo, and wanting to be part of how can we support them? What is data we can use? Can we help write some policy changes? How can we help with trainings? And then here at EJUSA, what drew me here was a recognition that reform is important and we need it and we've got to do it because so many people are ensnared in our system. But reform doesn't allow us to address violence differently. It's really hard to have a diversion program that's going to address our most violent crimes. And so the work that I get to do now is really about what are those solutions outside of the system to interrupt cycles of violence. And so that's been the career path.
Thank you. And I just think it's so interesting that all of you had experiences in your life where you were personally touched by the system, members of your family or you yourself, or members of your family, both as victims and as people who were charged in the system. And I see this, and to me, I think that's one of the reasons why you all are so effective in your work, because you understand from all different kind of personal perspectives on both sides. And I think that's what makes you all so effective at what you do, is your own personal experience. So I want to move on, though, to talk, before we talk about the challenges that you're facing, I want to talk about the accomplishments, because you, the two elected officials we have here have accomplished so much in their office to reduce the prison and jail population, to make the system fair. We could do a whole webinar just on that, so it pains me that they're not going to be able to tell you everything that they've done. But let me start with you this time, Kim. Talk to me about some of the things you've done in your office, what you're most proud of. You know, I could do this for you, but I'll let you do.
Thank
I
you.
won't chime in if you don't do it adequately.
I feel like you will fill in the blanks for me. Listen, it's been a really impactful 7 years, I would say. You know, when I came into office, you know, Cook County State's Attorney's office had a notorious reputation nationally. We were called the false confession capital of the United States for the number of wrongful convictions tied to false confessions. In fact, you know, part of the reason we were able to dismantle the death penalty here in Illinois was because of the history of false confessions and a horribly challenged police department. You know, at one point, John Burge, who tortured Black men on the South Side of Chicago into confessions. And so it was really important to me when I came into the office to legitimize who we were. What I knew is that the neighborhoods that were suffering the most violence had the least amount of trust in law enforcement because of that history. And that in order for us to keep our community safe, in our role in that, we had to be a legitimate institution. And legitimacy requires us to be honest about our history, honest about the harm that we have caused, and actively work to remedy that. And so over the course of the last 7 years, we have vacated the convictions of over 250 men and women, largely men and women of color, mostly Black men and women who were wrongfully convicted at the hands of police and prosecutorial misconduct. And we have celebrated that work in a way where we don't do it quietly, we do it loudly. We talk about it loudly. We affirm that those people who were wrongfully convicted were victims of a system and have apologized for that harm that we have caused, not just to those individuals and families, but to the legitimacy of this work. And so I'm very proud of the number of wrongful convictions, even though I believe it's just scratching the surface. We also played an instrumental role, I played an instrumental role in the abolition of cash bail here in Illinois. We are the first state in the country to have abolished the use of cash bail, an effort that we took on this office in 2017 when I first came in by establishing a policy of when we would ask for bail or not ask for bail, particularly on most low-level offenses or most offenses that did involve crimes of violence, working with activist advocates across the state over the course of the last 6+ years, testifying even against the opposition, which was all of the other state's attorneys in Illinois. There are 102 state's attorneys in Illinois. There were only 2 who were supportive of the abolition of cash bail. And last year, Illinois has led the country in what is, I think, fair and just reform. And then lastly, another thing that I'm very proud of, and again, these are things that I'm picking that outlast my tenure. So the abolition of cash bail will be there when I'm no longer state's attorney. These men and women will be free and be able to rebuild generations when I'm no longer state's attorney. And the last that I'm very proud of, and certainly among many, is our work on the legalization of marijuana. And not just for the legalization purpose, we then automatically expunged the records of anyone who was previously convicted for amounts that were now legal. Because we saw, again, the war on drugs have a horrific impact on the Black community, and that there were people in prison today, or people who had records, convictions, that would live with them for the rest of their lives, and the collateral consequences for things that are now, John Boehner sells marijuana, that we've seen a market that has minimized the impact of Black folks, but we had an outsized impact on the criminalization. And so we have automatically, with no cost, with no effort, for those who had those convictions, wiped those convictions away, to the tune of tens of thousands of convictions that we vacated on our own accord. And one of my proudest moments as state's attorney was walking into court myself, and filing those petitions for the first 100 men and women who would have a clean record. So those are 3 of my accomplishments that I am really incredibly proud of. And again, that have centered that community that I talked about, centering those people in neighborhoods that have been impacted by this system, by wrong policies, by trying to influence new policies, put them on the books, and right those historical wrongs.
Thank you. And that is just 3. There are so many more. I'm going to throw out the data dashboard you did, because I'm big on the fact that prosecutors have not been transparent. They make these decisions behind closed doors. I think you were the first prosecutor, chief prosecutor, to have such a open-facing, public-facing data dashboard so that the public could see what's going on in your office, which I thought was incredible. So I'll just add that one. Dahlia.
Well, first off, Angela, thank you so much for asking me this after Kim, but nonetheless, so Douglas County is a metro Atlanta jurisdiction, but we are definitely much smaller sized office. Our office in total is about 53 people. That's incorporating all of the different disciplines we have. So while our changes are much smaller on scale, the impact is really, I think, positive for the community and what we're doing. So things like creating our juvenile programs mentorship program, like Kim was talking about, just kind of understanding this interruption, the need to interrupt our school to prison pipelines, and how do we do that, and thinking outside the box of getting those ideas rolling. We also started our Goodwill Guardians project. So this was a collaboration we have with our Chamber of Commerce, because we understand that most of the individuals in our criminal legal system, most of them are poverty stricken, right? Most of the time we're seeing punitive measures of poverty restricted conduct. And so understanding that our victims were not immune from that as well, we partnered with businesses to contribute to a fund run by our Chamber of Commerce that we applied to in order to get funding for victims to be restored for their busted windows, their, hot tires, all the things that are happening, so that we can stand in the gap of them further falling behind within the poverty system. And so that's something we're really proud of. Our Project Plateau, where we are pushing through to try to eliminate any backlog here in Douglas County. Our team is doing a phenomenal job. We do 5Ks to raise funds for our local domestic violence shelters. We've partnered with For the People to work on our resentencing, because the problem is with the smaller office, we have to be creative in our collaboration, right? The amount of staffing we have is restrictive to the ideas and work that needs to be done. And so there's a lot of connections, a lot of collaborations, but also one of the proudest accomplishments I have is in the team we've assembled. We have a phenomenal team that is working here in our community, and more importantly, working for our community, which I think is much different than has been seen traditionally in DA's offices. I will say that we were most notorious. We were not having the same title as Kim's office prior to her administration, but we were the home of the Janarlo Wilson conviction, which was a grossly disparate impact on a young Black male, where there was an attempt to put him away for decades of his life for something that obviously the law changed to reflect the atrocities that were happening here. But I also, I really have to give my flowers, because a lot of these things, people across the spectrum can say, hey, we have something similar in our jurisdiction. But I really want to give the flowers to our trailblazers, because I did not come into office until 2021. And by that time, I had the distinct pleasure of being able to be handed a guidebook, a playbook by our pioneers, by people like Kim, by people like Kim Gardner, Marilyn Mosby, Rachel Rollins, even our vice president. Like, I was a baby prosecutor when she was the DA. And so watching what she was doing, similar to what Jami was talking about, like, oh, we could do diversion. Oh, we could do these other programs. And the list really goes on. It's because of them that the foundation was laid of this audacity of boldness to operate in these systems and to really bring about these programming and change. And so they already showed us the work can be done, and we could build upon it, and we can make it and tweak it to our systems. And so I am exceptionally appreciative of them and the groundwork that they laid for us to do this.
Thank you. And Jami, before we move on, can you just say a little bit about the impact that their work has had on our criminal legal system, how important it is?
Yeah. As I was just listening, all I could hear is how much this work is racial justice work. It may sound just like criminal justice reform, but it is racial justice work. I think most people who are attending this webinar are probably aware of the racial disparities that exist in our system. And when Kim talks about being able to do the important work of legalizing marijuana, we know even though Black people and white people use drugs at similar rates, 1 in 4 arrests for drug violations are Black people. And then the penalties that happen from that arrest, the disparities increase. So when you change the law and you make something that was illegal and was disproportionately impacting our communities, that is racial justice work. It is to really right the wrongs of so many things that were set up in our system. I'm hearing Dalia talk about the interrupting that school to prison pipeline. One of the places, I think as a country, we did finally get that incarcerating children, putting children in institutions was not a good thing. And so over the last, probably many years, we have had a significant decrease in who's detained in terms of juveniles, like the numbers of young people who are in custody, but the racial disparities of who's in custody have increased. And so, what is really important, Angela, you were saying this just after we all shared what brings us to the work, it truly is the ability to understand that these labels we apply, our system was set up very intentionally to be adversarial, and as prosecutors, I certainly was trained. You don't call a person who's accused by their name. They are the defendant in front of a jury. You don't humanize people. And these are leaders who are like, I reject that. No, we need to see whether you're a person who's been harmed or a person who's caused harm. You are a person of dignity and worth and value and worthy of investment. And I'm going to not just, we talk about this at EJUSA about the importance of a trauma-informed lens, because a trauma-informed lens helps you start saying, what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And that's the lens that I'm hearing in these examples of, instead of we're just going to have our normal pathway, we're going to actually create a mentoring program for our young people. And we're going to make sure that their needs are being met instead of just a sole focus on punishment, which is really what the system was intended to do. So it's important. And I think we're about to start talking a little bit about the challenges. And I think this is also why there's so much pushback. It's because of who benefits from the incredible work that they are doing.
Thank you for that, Jami. And yes, let's get right into that. So reform-minded, so-called progressive prosecutors who have implemented these policies that Dalia and Kim just talked about to improve the criminal legal system have been attacked in ways that we could not imagine by people who wanted to maintain the status quo. And I'm talking about attacks from every branch of government, right? From the executive branch, you got governors removing duly elected people from office, legislative bodies, you've got state legislatures passing laws to try to take away the power, specifically aimed at progressive prosecutors. You've got judges who have Kim knows about this, who have, gone after these prosecutors in ways that has never happened in the history of prosecutors, right? This long line of Supreme Court cases that protects the power of prosecutors. Courts protected it as long as they were locking people up. But when they started looking at, changing the system, all of a sudden now you've got all of these attacks coming from every direction. And a lot of progressive prosecutors have been attacked, but Black women chief prosecutors have been attacked more than any others and in ways that we could not imagine. Not only because of their policies, but because of who they are as Black women. So I'm going to ask you, Kim and Dahlia, and whoever wants to go first can, to talk about some of these challenges that you've faced since you've been in office.
I'm gonna go first because I will not go after Kim on this question. Listen, my sis has been under fire. She has taken the brunt of the blows aimed, on our behalf. And so again, the gratitude that I have, but the atrocities that it's even happening is huge. And I think what really fuels it is that if what we're doing works, that means we're proving they were wrong. And so this visceral response to what we're doing is expected but disappointing all at the same time. Now, I said already, I'm a career prosecutor, 17 years experience. Every office I worked in received the accolades, attorney of the year, like given the leadership responsibility, handled the cases, done all the things. But coming here, I was definitely shrouded with the presumption of incompetence. I didn't know what I was doing. And like we often find ourselves of having to prove ourselves worthy of the roles that have been bestowed upon us. And so there was no exception to that. I will say I ran for 10 years to have this position. There was a large presence of, there was an establishment in place. And, me running for DA in 2010, shook that up a little bit, and nothing worse than a scared establishment. And so things like the first time my name was on the ballot, I took a picture, was saying like how proud I am of this moment. This is historic. This is huge for me, my family, culture, like all the things. And then it was reported to the Secretary of State because there is some old archaic law on the Georgia books about the fact that taking a picture of your ballot is considered a part of vote buying. And so an investigation was launched into me about that picture that was taken. Like switching support of people who were able to support me and the pressure that was put on them by the establishment to switch their alliance. Commenting on who I was as a mother somehow became relevant to me running for office for a district attorney. And I think also probably exclusive, I would assume to all women candidates, but like I could tell y'all my messages on my campaign area, things like that, I mean, overloaded with pictures of genitalia, like just the most obscene things being said, being sent, just completely disrespectful. But I think what's interesting is, I mean, I feel like I operate under a cloak of racial ambiguity, right? And so sometimes I'm privy to the conversations that they do not know that they are talking about me in those conversations. And I think obviously that's shifted a bit more so now, but I think all of us in this space, we know what those agencies say about us. We know what disrespect, we know what discontentment with what we're doing. We know Kim obviously is way more audibly, they're way more visual about it. In my jurisdiction, it's a little bit more undercover, but I know. And then having to show up in those spaces with those same system partners, and you're having to be the bigger person, rise above, pretend you don't know these things, this insulting nature of what was said, done, etc., because of the prioritization of the work, right? And so it is really big. It is a lot of things. When I finally was elected, there was a mandate that the sheriff's department join the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, because I was coming into office. Like, it's the little microaggressions of what happens when we take office. I will also talk about the fact that we started doing disposition reports, weekly disposition reports. Again, we're a smaller jurisdiction, so our law enforcement agencies were saying, we don't know what happens with our cases once they go to your office. And so we're like, fine, we will communicate with you. And so there were things that were posted that we know were being fed from law enforcement partners to the community, where they would then come and attack and say, oh, they're just dismissing cases. And we told you this would happen. We told you this is what was going to happen. And so, I would have judges' wives liking comments of my trolls. And it's just like, I think it was the intimacy of a smaller community that these people who are doing these things, saying these things, you see them out at the events, all the different types of things. But with those dispo reports, what we started doing, our team started being very descriptive in the reasons for the dismissals, such as you lacked evidence, violated laws, there were rights that were violated, all these different types of things. And somehow the chatter has quieted down a little bit. But those were things that my predecessors never had to deal with. The times where you're not invited to the table, or you just show up and you pull up your chair and you sit down. Like, these are things that I feel like a lot of individuals that have served in my position previously never had to deal with. But yeah, I would say it is a strong attack on anything that is different from what they are used to. But I think that a big piece too is, as you alluded to, Angela, the state legislature. So in Georgia in 2020, we had a groundbreaking sweep of DAs that were elected that were predominantly Black women across the state, and other Black men and other women of color that were also elected as part of this coalition. Well, all of a sudden, we didn't need to have discretion. All of a sudden, we should not have the autonomy to do our job. And so we are still actively fighting legislation that is trying to quiet our voices. Things like when people ask us, what is our opinion on the death penalty? If we express our opinion on the death penalty, then the commission can come remove us from our seats, not discipline us, remove us from our seats and prevent us from running for these positions for 10 years. And nobody is confused that this is completely motivated by the fact that we have now communities of color representing communities of color. And all of a sudden, number one, our voters aren't smart enough to vote for their electeds. And number two, we don't know what we're doing, because again, circles back to, if we're right, then they were wrong.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And, these attacks on the discretion of prosecutors, not all prosecutors, just blatantly directing it at people who are trying to change. It's anti-democratic. It's taking away the voice of the people. But let me not get started. Kim, and thank you for sharing all of that, Dahlia. Kim, please.
Yeah, I have, it is no surprise to the folks on this call. I've endured a lot of attacks since I came into the role. I should say, I recognize that my mere presence, policy aside, is disruptive. We talk, when we read my bio as the first Black woman to do this role, it almost feels passive. I think we don't appreciate how huge it is in a system that is overwhelmingly Black, in a county like Cook, which has a large Black population, where the jail is largely Black, where our victims of crime are largely Black. That in the history of this office, actually, there had never been a Black person elected to this role. And so having someone from that demographic, just racial demographic, but also, if you know me, I'm going to talk about Cabrini in every speech I give, because I think even more so than being a Black woman, it is coming from a community that has been impacted by this system and the failures of so many other systems, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's economic disinvestment, and talking about these issues in a way that is more nuanced than, good guy, bad guy, tough, soft. I'm going to make you safer by doing, and it's like, hey, the criminal legal system is the last stop on a train ride of policy failures that disproportionately impact Black folks. Talking about structural racism, using the word racism alone in my run it's very disruptive when everybody who has had this role before you doesn't come from those communities. And so my presence and my unapologetic reminder that I'm a 6 foot tall, dark-skinned Black woman from 624 West Division. I am unlike anybody who has sat here before, and I have no intention to conform to that. And I said this when I ran, I joke having come up as a child in the 80s and watching movies where the women who were going into the workplace, wore these suits with the big shoulder pads. And it was like, I'm going to blend in because it is safer that way. When 1% of us doing this work, which is in law enforcement, which is very male dominated, which feels very much exclusive, there is a tendency, particularly for those who are first, to try their best to conform for their own safety. I just think it's really important that we acknowledge that. And what I knew coming in was I was not going to be safe. I was not going to be safe. And that no matter if I did my best impersonation of a white man, I don't belong here. I don't belong here. And I think what you have seen, not just with myself or what Dahlia explained, but with Tish James, with Fonnie Willis, with Marilyn Mosby, with Kim Gardner, a lot of what happens in the upswell against them is they don't have the right mindset to do this work. And that is because of who they are. And so I've seen things like, emails that I'm on where people refer to me as the C word while I'm on the emails. I have had the Fraternal Order of Police march on my office with members of QAnon in 2019, before any of us really fully appreciated what QAnon was, that the Proud Boys marched with the FOP and QAnon on my office. I've been doxxed. I have, Dahlia talks about, the sexualized nature of the attacks. My name is Fox with 2 X's. I've seen the 3 X's. When people threaten me, they don't just threaten to, remove me. I'm going to be raped first and then hung from a tree. There's a man who served prison time, federal prison time, for threatening to rattle my brain with bullets. There's a man locally who was just prosecuted for saying he was going to shoot me and hang me from a tree. And so there's no, in as much as there's no apology for who I am, there's also no hiding that there's racial animus to this, that this isn't just, and my pushback on progressive, this isn't just progressive. It is who gets to make the calls, because those calls are questioned in ways, I very famously, took a lot of heat, and it relates to the Jussie Smollett case, which, again, not to feed into the fervor about it, but every day our office makes discretionary decisions on what we charge, not charge, who we charge, how it goes, without question. And in that case, people didn't like the outcome, and a special prosecutor was assigned. And a special prosecutor who was assigned at county payer expense, who subpoenaed my phone and went through my phone and all my pictures on my phone, who impaneled a grand jury, because the assumption was not just this was a decision that we didn't agree with, that I must have been corrupt because my office made the call. The assumption of corruption, the assumption of incompetence, the assumption of mislaid loyalties, the assumption that I am somehow in cahoots with criminal elements. That was one of the things that, her family is gang involved, and it permeates. And the thing I will leave this on, because I could go on and on with examples, is the frustration that I have is not by the troll, but it is by the legitimizing of the effort by people in institutions who know better. So it is legislatures that have folded and created these new laws. It is a media landscape that recognizes that, when Kim Foxx is involved, there's a lot of trolls who are going to log on to say hateful things. And so you then get engagement as a result of that. And so there have been stories where I am minimally involved and I see my name or I see my picture, And the vitriol that comes and the studies that have been done, particularly around social media and the attacks on Black women in social media, is part of an engine for something else. And so it is the legitimizing of the attacks on Black women. It is the ignoring that this, in fact, is racially and gender motivated. That isn't just in prosecution. You know, I mentioned this in our prep. You know, I look at what happened with Claudine Gay at Harvard. It is in academia. It is in all facets where we historically have not belonged. The attacks are consistent, fervent, and unrelenting. And so, you know, this is a panel about us as prosecutors, but I dare us to look at institutions where you are a first or you are an only that has historically excluded you. And I think the stories will be eerily similar.
I just add quickly, because Kim brought up such a powerful point. It's not just the legitimization, it's the profitization off of this, right? To her point of what she's saying, it's the clickbait. We know we're going to engage. We know we're going to get folks to come to this page. And it's like the public virtual hanging of Black women in powers of position because it sells headlines, it sells papers, it gets the clicks to get the advertising dollars. It is so deep on so many levels as to how the trauma of Black women leadership has been marketed and profitized.
I know, I'm sorry. There's one last point on that. See, Dahlia, it's absolutely right. And it's, they know, because they're watching it. I chose not to run for re-election. I am not in our election here for my replacement is in a month. There is not a single article that is being written about this election that doesn't mention me. And not just mention me that I'm vacating the seat. It is language. Like they love to say that I am embattled, right? That is, we embattled state's attorney. And I'm like, I gotta watch my language. What battle? I won. Y'all had me, you were fighting me, you protested, you came. I won twice. But it is the language of embattled. I'm not embattled. And even when you write about me and the choice that I made to not run again, a choice that I made for myself and for my family, you know, controversial state's attorney, or these people don't like. And it's like, well, we feel compelled because there are people who don't like you. When the people who do believe in my policies, which are Black and brown communities who have been impacted, it is the subtle dismissal of their affirmation that this is what they want by labeling me as controversial. Then it allows for us to not talk about substance, it becomes about personality. And they do it with Black women with such efficacy that we will spend our time over the last couple of weeks talking about a consensual romantic relationship in the prosecution of our former president, so that we don't have to talk about the stealing of an election. It is that legitimization that is problematic across the board.
So, Kim, I have to say a couple of things. One, despite you pointed this out, but I gotta just put another pin on it. Despite all that, when you ran again, the people overwhelmingly reelected you, right? Despite all their efforts, the people, it wasn't a squeaker. They overwhelmingly said, yeah, we like that. We want some more. We're electing her anyway. And I also want to point out something you left out, that special prosecutor who they spent millions of dollars trying to uncover something you've done wrong, when you did what prosecutors have been doing since the history of prosecutors in this country, which is dismissing cases, which is in their discretion, a nonviolent case. And I will name the National District Attorneys Association, which should have been there protecting you, had the nerve to put out a statement criticizing you, which you would think that they would have supported your decision. But the point you left out was, after spending all those millions of dollars investigating you, they found nothing that you had done wrong, not a thing, and wasted the taxpayers' money. I just had to.
Well, let me just put a fine point on that, and I apologize. But it wasn't even about, I knew they weren't going to find anything. There's not an article that is written about me that doesn't mention Justice Smollett's name. There will not be, in all of those accomplishments that I started this panel with, when they write about my exit, they will make sure to put in, because the purpose of it was the taint. It is something, you don't have to find the thing. You ask people today, like, what is it that I did wrong with it? They can't articulate it, but we've repeated it so much over so much time that there's an assumption that I did, even though that report came out that I didn't. And the last thing on that point, the lawyer who was brought in to prosecute me, Dan Webb, went on to defend, ironically, Fox News in the libel suit against Fox News, defending Fox for telling lies. This is who, and again, politically motivated. This was a person who was brought down by Trump to represent him. But you can't even say these things as it's happening. And I know I'm going over time, because you don't want to invoke race and gender to and you hope beyond hope that the process will work itself out, that people will see what this is, and that the moment that you cry about it being racially or gender motivated, that it is immediately dismissed and you are minimized. And so you take on a lot of these fights. You don't say the thing that you want and need to say under the belief that the system will work itself out. And in that, it is an appreciation of what those who are accused in our criminal justice system have gone through. And what that system looks like, that I have a deeper appreciation for.
And, they can say it's not about race, but when you look at the people who have been the most attacked, it's not a coincidence that they're Black women. I think of Kim Gardner, who once again faced the same kind of virulent attacks, but like you, was reelected by the people. So I'm going to turn to you, Jami, just in the few minutes we have left here before we take questions. First of all, before asking you your view on what you think has motivated these attacks, I want to point out that because you won't say this, I'll say it, that I was there when you recognized the need to support these Black women. It was in Montgomery, Alabama. I won't get into what happened there, but I was there when the light bulb went off in your head and you said, we have to support these women because this is a thing here, attacking Black women chief prosecutors. And you created this wonderful support group for these women. And I have to thank you for it. And I know these women thank you for it as well. But I just had to shout you out for that. But I do want to get your view on what's motivating this.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kim really covered it well. It is racial, it is gender, it is the combination. It's that they sit at the intersection, and Kimberly Crenshaw's amazing scholarship on intersectionality, they are proof points, and I think what will always stand out to me about that conversation in Montgomery is that it was at a table full of other progressive or reform-minded prosecutors. It was a table of other women. There was at least one Black man who was running a prosecutor's office, and everybody's mouths were on the floor when they heard what were happening to Black women. It's not that there's not pushback, but there's definitely been pushback. But for these other groups, it's a policy pushback. It is we're going to mount a campaign and run somebody else who will do the policies different. When it came to these particular women, it was very personal. It almost wasn't even about the policies. It was very intentionally personal. And so to hear the attacks that they faced to their own safety, to their children's safety, to the language that was used, that people weren't afraid. Like, they were out in the open. That march on Kim's office was out in the public for the news to cover. There was nothing hidden about what was happening here. And so for me, it was one, just the shock that here I was working in the space and supporting, including doing close work with Kim Gardner, but I had not heard the stories that she shared in that moment, shared the kinds of attacks she was facing. And so if I don't know it as someone working really closely, then nobody knew. People were not aware of the way that they were intentionally having to literally worry about their own physical safety and just carrying out a job that they were elected to do. And then, so there were a few things I wanted to address. One, I felt like people needed to know, that this was happening. This shouldn't be a secret. This shouldn't be something that they're just bearing alone. They also needed to know, like, they're in different parts of the country. And what was clear is it wasn't just happening to one person. You know, it was happening in two Black women, in regardless of where they were, and that they shouldn't have to bear it alone. That there is a community, but you have to create community. These are very busy jobs that are very demanding, and so being able to say, no, we're going to create a space to bring you together so that you can build relationship and know that you don't have to walk this out alone. So to combat that isolation. And then thirdly, like, what can we actually do in real time to support? And really, Angela, I want to give you and Whitney Tymas, you know, so many flowers, because that thought partnership together, like this wasn't, you know, I wasn't alone and like, need to do something. I called y'all and we spent hours on the phone, one kind of crying about the fact that this was happening, you know, and that we had been unaware, but then really being thought partners together on what we can do about it and making sure that there is some communications response, you know, there's this press that's running, we're going to put some other things out. We're going to actually lift up the positive work. We're going to call out the racist attacks. So the idea was really to address those three things, that they were not alone, and create community, raise awareness, and then also what are some concrete things that we could do to support in the launch of Black Women Lead. And I'm grateful that work still exists and is still going, and that the community still exists.
Thank you for that. So we want to invite members of the audience here who have questions to please put your questions in the chat, and we'll take those questions. And while you're doing that, I'm going to ask our panelists to give some advice here. We've got some Black women line prosecutors in the audience here. We've got students in the audience. We have others in the audience who care about these issues. You don't have to give advice to all of those people. You can if you want to, but if you have any advice that you'd like to give to anyone that's in any of those spaces, I invite you now to share.
Jami, why don't you go first this time?
I'm happy to, because I thought about this. The advice I want to share is literally advice that my brother, who is, I say, one of my favorite people in the world, you know, I share, he gives me permission to share what he went through in terms of his own journey and journey through incarceration. But he serves in a beautiful ministry helping men who battle addiction now. But he had an opportunity last week to record a video for my oldest daughter, who's 11, to give some advice and say some words of encouragement. And in that video, what he said was, you know, one of the things that is beautiful about you is your passion. You do everything with your whole heart. And so my advice to you is to never let that passion be dimmed, that he referenced Philippians 2:15, you be a star that shines in the sky. And that has sat with me so much, because I think as Black women, we live in a society that does not want us to take up space, that wants to dim our light. And sometimes in spite of and I think about that raising two girls, in spite of like every effort I'm trying to pour into them and to tell them, you are supposed to be here. You are special. You take up the space. I know that the messages they're getting from a society around them is the opposite. So my advice would be to anyone, particularly a Black woman who is sitting in a room and afraid to use her voice, or who hesitates on how something she's going to say will be received, you let your light shine. You be that star that shines in the sky, because there's a reason there's all this pushback. It's because there is so much greatness and so much change, as we've just heard, that can happen when you have people who actually care, who hold these positions of power and use that power differently. So be that shining star, and don't let anything around you tell you that you should not be.
Wonderful. Anyone else want to share?
I would just say really three things. Number one, find your support system. It's crucial in this work. I am blessed to have really close and dear friends, a husband who is a great confidant, but also the work is lonely. I mean, we've heard that on a national landscape, but the actuality is that the work is very, very lonely. And there's a very, very small sphere of people who understand that at its core. It's an unspoken reality amongst us. And so I am blessed to have that really close core support system who State's Attorney Fox is lucky to be part of. No. But I think that is critical to Jami's point, because when people are trying to dampen your greatness, a big strategy to that is isolation. And so having that support system is huge. Secondly, faith in your failures. When you're going against a system that you feel needs to be righted, things don't go smoothly, right? There's going to be setbacks, there's going to be obstacles, all these things. So having faith in your failures. And also, when you look around and you see things and you say, man, something should be done about this, have that boldness, that audacity to say, why not me? And step up. Because if you see it, there is the opportunity, and you will find those support systems, and you will find those like-minded folks to just do it. Because I will tell you, from the position I sit in, we need you. We need you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would second all of that. The isolation piece is very real. It's designed to be isolating. It's designed to have you feel alone. Like, I think the pressures that we've seen in some of the names that we've already said, you know, were meant to have you leave. It is meant to not even just for you, it's to send a message to those who are watching you that should you decide to do this work, this is what's coming. And so when I started in 2016, again, the numbers were relatively low of Black women doing this work. But as Dahlia pointed out, we then started seeing, oh my gosh, we could run like that. You know, we could run unapologetically as Black women, and we could run talking about reform, and we started to win, and then the attacks got heavier. And so it is meant to have a chilling effect on those who are coming. And so what I tell folks who do this work, and I was trying to read some of the questions in the chat. I don't have my readers on because they're not as cute. But what I would tell is that I'm honest about what this looks like. And I'm honest with law students that I meet, high school students that I meet, that when you are breaking a glass ceiling, you are going to have your head cut. It is just what it is. When your head goes through, there are cuts that you sustain. And what I have to remind myself of is that it is bigger than me. You know, in one of our group chats, Marilyn Mosby would always say, it's bigger than us, it's bigger than us. It absolutely is. It doesn't mean that you aren't fortified. It doesn't mean that you don't have your circle who are with you, both who do this work and folks like Jami who put her hands on your back as you're doing the work, or you, Angela, or Whitney, that those folks are doing it. It doesn't make the pain it doesn't take the pain away. You know, Dahlia talks about, you know, the network. You know, I started this work, you know, married. I've gotten divorced having done this work. I'm honest about that, what the demands were on me, on my life, on my children. I parented during this work, and what did it mean for my children? I think we have to be honest with women who are doing this, with Black women who are doing this. We don't sugarcoat it. And then we also remind that there are shoulders that we stand on to be here today, of people who have navigated far treacherous, different, but yet treacherous, that have afforded us the opportunity to be here. And the last thing I will say, because I think I saw this when I could sort of see, was we don't see this space. We are not welcome here. Let me just be blunt. Black women prosecutors, Black top prosecutors are not welcome in this space. And I say that not knowing who is in this room. I know from my own experience, we are not welcome here, despite the fact that we have an impact on communities just like ours. And that's why we are not welcome. That historically, we should be subjected to the system. We should not be in charge of the system. Knowing that, and knowing the efforts that have been made to exclude us from these roles, it is why we do not cede the space to those who seek to use this position to cause harm. However painful it is to do it, you fortify yourself with those means, but we do not cede the space. The policy changes that we are trying to make are not changes that are just in one term or two terms. It's why I started with things that will outlast me. But do not come into this role with the preconceived notions about prosecutors and what you know. And so I'm just not going to do that. I'm going to be over here. That is what they are counting on. They're counting on us overwhelming on the defense side and staying away from the prosecution side, because when we are here, you see the things that can change. And so do not cede the space. Know that it will be hard. Fortify your community and know that there have been people who have done a lot to pave the way for you to be here, and that there are people who are counting on you to make space for them.
Thank you for that. And we just have a few minutes left, but I want to ask one of the questions that's in the chat. I'll take this privilege since I'm a law professor. It's from a law student who says, what advice would you have for students who want to be prosecutors but are conflicted because starting as a line prosecutor often means that you have to implement prosecution and sentencing policies that you disagree with? And I will say, I grapple with this one. I'm fortunate, though, to be at a law school where I would say, and I've been teaching for almost 30 years, in the last at least 10 years, I do a lot of career advising throughout, but in the last at least 10 years, every single student who comes to me and says, I want to be a prosecutor, but only if I can work in the office of a reform-minded, prosecutor who's about changing the system. That's probably just my law school because that's how we roll, but that's what I get. But the reality is that they're not a lot in the scheme of things of those offices. They're all, thousands of prosecutor offices and, not a handful, but, it depending on how you defined it, 30, 40 offices that are really doing progressive work. So would you advise them to just not take a prosecutor job and wait until you can get into a reform-minded office? Or would you say go into one of those offices, and if they do, then what about that problem? How do they manage that going into an office where the leader is not really implementing policies that they believe in? How can they do that?
Yeah, it's the infiltration methodology, right? Because once you're inside, your ability to shape, even if it's finite, even if it's like the starfish theory, this case I can make an impact on, and then showing and using that as fodder to compel, to argue, to analyze, to say this works when we do this. It's so much more impactful, I think, coming from the inside than somebody from the outside convincing you, saying you're doing it wrong. You know what I'm saying? And so I think there's a big part to that, but that alone, in doing that and taking that helm, can be isolating, right? You're the eyeball of the crew, which goes into another question I saw in the chat about support organizations, because I've had the privilege of working in majority minority offices my entire prosecution career. But that is the exception and not the rule. So there are organizations like National Black Prosecutors Association that are extremely supportive in connecting Black prosecutors who are the onlys or only a few in their office with others for that support system that we're talking about, for that, camaraderie, even that strategy, right? For the line prosecutors, hey, this is what my DA does. How do you deal with this? How do you navigate through the very issues that are being brought up? It can be extremely impactful. And then to allyship, which I also saw on here, because I think that is important too, is finding who those allies are, finding who the voice is. I mean, my second in command is a white male. And there are certain messaging and methodologies that I utilize to send out those messages to different agencies where I use him as my mouthpiece because it will be received. So it's being strategic as well in your allyship, because there are individuals who are aligned with us who do want to help in the work as well.
Jami, you were in that space.
Yes, I literally was thinking about that. And because prosecutors do have a lot of discretion, and even under like charging policies and guidelines, you still have discretion. It really matters to have someone who understands the power of the system, sees the humanity and dignity of every person involved in that case, to be making decisions and to be, implementing, even if it is a policy that overall there's some disagreement with. So I definitely encourage people to take the job, and because in that person's life or that case, it's going to matter. It will matter. And then I wanted to touch on the allyship question too. I saw that one of the things that I tried to do, particularly when I was at Vera doing that work, was to recognize as an elected, sometimes that there can be a limitation on what the elected prosecutors can say themselves. And so how do we, say the things that they can't say? Like I personally believe it's like part of my mantle. I cannot be in a room where there's a conversation about criminal justice reform and race is not mentioned. If it has not been mentioned, I will be the one bringing it up, so it is, but that burden can't be on, they're trying to do the job. Someone else needs to be pointing out, the things that they are up against and what they're facing, and, be able to speak a little bit more freely because they don't have to worry about a reelection, and things like that. So that's definitely another way that support.
Do you agree with that, Kim, that like they should, even if they can't get a job working in a reform office, that they should go to the other? Do you agree with that? Because there are I've heard some prosecutors say, just wait until I can hire you, or just wait until you can get a job with me. I mean, what do you think?
I mean, I run the office that I used to work in. And I talked about the nature of this office. I was a line assistant in that office. And so, I wasn't born into the lead. I worked there for a dozen years. And it was in doing that work. And again, as Dahlia talked about, the impact that you can have on those individual cases, the impact that you can have in conversations with your colleagues, in the way that they talk. Dahlia talked about people not appreciating, maybe who she was. I'd have people talk about my neighborhood. They thought I was a lawyer. She's so articulate. And it's like, yo, I'm from over there. When it's not us versus them, I'm one of them. And the impact that has and the conversations that we could have and that influence that you can have. There's still influence that you have when you, as my colleague said earlier, show up as your authentic self, when you allow yourself to shine, even on the line. That has influence on how other people do their work. And so I would just remind folks that I wasn't born as a Cook County State's Attorney. I worked on the line. And we need folks on the line in this kind of selective waiting. We don't change these centuries old positions by ceding the space. I just go back to that point. We are making move. There is momentum. I saw the question about the pendulum swinging back. I'm very worried about that. I'm absolutely feeling it very acutely here in Chicago, the possibility that comes back. But we have to infiltrate these spaces to make it harder to do that. And when we don't infiltrate, when we simply say it's not progressive enough for me, then that person who is like, great, I can't wait to bring in my ultra conservative punitive method, they will take your spot. They will sit in that courtroom. And I just don't believe we give them that space.
So thanks for answering that question, because I want to ask another question that was in the chat, which is, what are the most impactful book recommendations that you can give? And I will start. They're probably not even asking me, but I'm going to start by shouting out. I got to shout out Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. Everybody should read Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. But I also want to shout out books by Black women. One of them is a book of essays that includes an essay by Kim Fox. It's called Progressive Prosecution, Race and Reform in Criminal Justice. And it's edited by Kim Taylor Thompson, a Black woman, and her husband, Tony Thompson. For anybody who's interested in progressive prosecution, please read this book. Kim's essay is particularly impactful. And I also want to recommend another book by a Black woman, Kristen Henning. This book had a great impact on me personally. It's called The Rage of Innocence. I don't know if you can see it. How America Criminalizes Black Youth by Kristen Henning, a Black woman, former public defender, actually, who is a professor at Georgetown. This book had an incredible impact on me, talking about Black youth. Those are my recommendations. I don't know if any recommendations come to mind for any of you.
First off, Angela, how fair is it that you had the books right there to put up on screen?
And I didn't know that question was going to be asked.
I co-sign those books. I think there's a lot of books about this space. I will also say my reading time has shrunk for actual content material. I like escapism reading at this time period for my self-care. But those are both great books, along with the adultification study done by Georgetown on the adultification of young Black girls. Another phenomenal study, short read if you don't have time for an entire book. But I think one that has helped me in the professional development is how to give 0 Fs. It's actually the full word, but just as kind of mind control and being in this space of staying focused on the philosophy and the purpose, and to, like what Jami was saying, this is a calling, right? If you're drawn to this, or you're not doing it for the money, you're not doing it for the applause, the appreciation, because none of those things really come with this work, but this is purpose work. And so how, when you're in your purpose work, but you are getting beaten up as you are on that pathway, to kind of stay focused along those lines as well.
I'm gonna throw out Policing the Black Man by one Angela Davis, that it talks about, arrest, prosecution, and the imprisonment of Black men. I think it is incredibly jarring work and a reminder of why we do what we do. I too recommend Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. Again, talking about proximity. And I say that again for people who, come from these communities who don't want to work in these spaces. It is your proximity to those spaces that make you that much more impactful. So as it relates to the work, those are books that mean a lot to me.
Thank you, Kim. And I'm glad you pointed out, because that book, Arbitrary Justice, is my book, but Policing the Black Man is a book I edited, and it includes essays by people like Brian Stevenson, Sherilyn Ifill, Roger Fairfax, who you mentioned earlier, and many others, and Chris Henning. I know I want to respect the time of these busy chief prosecutors. I'm going to ask one more question that's in the chat. And this question is as follows: not all Black prosecutors are progressive. And then it goes on to say, how do we challenge Black prosecutors who basically replicate white supremacy policies?
I think not just Black prosecutors in general. I think it's really, really important for us to engage in broadening perspectives. I think all of us on this panel, we're shaped by our own personal journeys as to what brought us to our life's work, right? And some people don't have that history. They don't have that connectivity to the hurt. One of the famous sayings that State's Attorney Fox and I use between each other is hurt people hurt people. Mm-hmm. But it is true. It is in fact true. And sometimes what I think the best strategy in reshaping what prosecution looks like is exposure to perspectives outside of what maybe you were exposed to. So what that looks like is, poverty simulators, listening to people who are recovering from addiction, listening to previously incarcerated populations, because I think Jami brought it up before, early on, like, we are really, really good in prosecution at dehumanizing people. We turn people into paper. And how do we rehumanize them again? And I think a big part of that is the introduction of perspectives. It can be greatly impactful. I know it has been for me in my own personal journey, and I think corporately as a profession, we really, really need it, because we are taught from the old system that this is just about, black and white, that there is no gray. But that is not the world we live in. And so it's really important that we get those perspectives.
I agree wholeheartedly. I would say this, the humanity piece, we took a tour. We took 20 of my assistants to Stateville Prison last week. And the majority of them were white. They'd never been to a prison. They'd never seen the place that was just a number to them. And we sat in circle with the people who were incarcerated there without cuffs, without, leg straps, and sat and talked. And before we left, it was an impactful several hours. I heard, and we had a number of our chiefs, not even knowing that I could hear them, planning the next trip for the next group of people to go. And it meant so much to me because I know, again, my tenure is coming to an end, that impact, that like we need to see this and we need to engage in this, as discomforting as it was for many of them. I had done it, right? They had not. Was impactful. But I do want to get to the point that it isn't just about race. When we talked about progressive policies, we're not a monolith. Black folks who come into this work are not a monolith. There are some folks who, have a very conservative view of what this looks like. And I don't care if you are Black or brown, or like if you are upholding a system of white supremacy, you need to be challenged on that. And I just think it's important. I watched, and you talk about when I was attacked and the NDAA came out against me, my disappointment wasn't so much just with the white members of the NDAA. It was the Black ones that was, you see what this is, you know what this is. I'm going to expect white supremacy to do what white supremacy does. I have a level of disdain for those who have been impacted by it, who've had their neck with the boot imprint on it, try to uphold systems. And so, the Stevens from Django don't work well with me. And I have no problem with pushing back on that. But I don't think we give a pass just for race. I think what this panel is about are Black women who have been pushing for progressive policies, who have felt the absolute sting of trying to disrupt a system. I believe even if we were trying to uphold the system, we would still get some measure of vitriol because we don't belong here. But I think the intensity and the relentlessness of the attacks that you are seeing, particularly on Black women, are because these women have chosen a path of reform that have left them exposed. And we have to honor that. And for those who don't, there was a DA in Los Angeles a couple years ago whose policies were not aligned with what I believed were a progressive vision. And I supported a candidate against her without apology. And I think we can't afford to get caught up in the notion that all skin folk are kinfolk, because they are not. And we can put in the chat where that quote comes from for those who may not have heard that before, but all skin folk and kinfolk. And we should not align around people whose values are not aligned with ours.
Thank you, Kim. And thank you for saying that quote, because I was going to try to say it and I was probably going to mess it up, as I do every time I try to say it. We're at the end of our hour. Jama, did you have anything you wanted to add before we close?
Just on that point, I think I have just had a little bit more grace for conservative Black colleagues. And it's through proximity, right? It's through actually having a chance to build relationship and learn their story. And often at the root of it is pain. And so, I would say part of it is, yes, we need to be, unrelenting in taking down white supremacy, and regardless of who is implementing and holding up those structures. But that sometimes if you will get to know a person and get to understand why it is or where it's coming from, there's a chance to bring them along.
Thank you, Jami. And Rachel just pointed out that quote is from Zora Neale Hurston, which I did not know. Amazing. Thank you all. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists today. Thanks again to the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution. Thank you for having all of us. Chantel, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you so much. And just to reiterate, thank you to our esteemed panelists for this critically needed conversation. And thank you, Professor Davis, for leading this conversation. The IAP will continue to share information, resources, and advocacy on this issue. Please check out our website at prosecution.org for more information, to watch today's recording, which we will post shortly, or to sign up for our mailing list so you don't miss future events. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you next